one of the big reasons why I've invited you all here is to talk about what we're developing. But I'm not here to just kind of present it to you and say, and have you tell me how great it is. This is a workshop. So I want to present what we're building. I want to show you what we've built so far, where we'd like to go, but I'd also like to have your comments on kind of what would be most useful for you as a researcher, what interests you as somebody who designs war games, and then for those who use war games for teaching or policy outreach, whether what we're designing is something that is useful and helpful. Okay, so all right, why are we all here? I kind of almost don't need to say it to this room, which is that war games are kind of having a moment. They're getting maybe a disproportionate amount of attention in public news. And they are also kind of overtly being used to influence not just the defense planning process that we just talked about, but also the policy planning process. So there has never been a better time to talk about kind of what makes a good war game and how we think about the use of wargaming for foreign policy. Next slide. Okay, but you're going to tell me that's great that we're talking about something that seems like a big deal now. War games are having a moment, but the reality is the war games have been around for a really long time. And so part of why I'm here is to talk not just about how contemporary war games affect U.S. policy, but instead to think about how we can, as a community, preserve war games, whether they're historical war games, next slide, or contemporary war games. And I think it would be it would be almost impossible to understand what wargaming is today if we don't do a good job of understanding the way wargaming influenced U.S. defense planning, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Next slide. Okay, so war games are having a moment, but they're having a moment for a few reasons. One is that, and some of the people in this room can have used this data, there is new data. There are new declassified games that researchers are using to ask big questions about ethics, about nuclear planning, about morality, and these games are already influencing our discussions about wargaming. But there's also new policy think tank unclassified games. The work that people like Stacy Pettyjohn and Becca Wasser have done at CNAS and the team at CSIS to try and do games that can be evaluated, that are presented to the public. That presents a whole new set of data. And then I think going back to Bob Work and the 2010s and the third offset, there is like a real focus and reinvigoration of wargaming also within the defense community. So wargaming, there's all new sets of possibilities. Now in academia, there are also things that are happening which are influencing wargaming. And I'm biased, I think making war games better. And part of that is, large and iterative war games. War games that are run over a long period of time with a lot of different participants. War games that are run virtually. War games that integrate new types of data collection methods, whether that's surveys, recordings. So we have all these new methods that are happening in the scholarly space, combined with all this new data that's coming out from the practitioner space. And I think that's a natural combination to think about the future of wargaming. Next slide. All right, so what are we doing? And I want to be really, really honest here, because coming to Washington, D.C. to talk about doing wargaming in any sort of different or useful way is tough. This is a city that does war games, and it does war games well, and it does war games a lot. So who are we to step into this kind of, I live in Silicon Valley now, so I can say it, this ecosystem. And so I want to tell you kind of what makes us a little bit different and the same. So our vision really is to advance war games, but to advance not just war games, but war games and their data. To do that for policy outreach, but also for academic questions and to help industry. And the idea is that Hoover, sitting at Stanford University as I'm going to call it a policy think tank, not everyone agrees with that, but having kind of policy-focused institutions sitting at one of the top research universities in the world really has a special opportunity to bridge a divide between the scholarly and the academic and kind of the more practitioner-focused wargaming community. And that's where we see ourselves sitting, is in that bridge. And the focus, most importantly, being on data. How we look at wargaming data, how we evaluate wargaming data, how we test wargaming data, and I'll talk to you about kind of how we plan to do that. Next slide. All right, so I've talked a little bit about this, So what makes us different? I think the primary thing that makes us different is this building right here, which is a lovely architectural edifice on Hoover, but it is actually a library and archive. And so the key cornerstone of the Hoover Institution has been its ability to take really important information and curate that information, preserve that information, and keep it protected for people to use for centuries. And so we're building on kind of that core competency that Hoover has in the archives, and then relying on our fellows who are deep in scholarship to really bridge that academic policy divide. Next slide. Okay, so these are our 3 pillars. And don't worry, you don't even have to read them here because you all have it in your nice cards in front of you. If you're like me, you're getting older and things are getting a little harder to read. But these are the 3 main kind of lines of effort. The first in our cornerstone is the Wargaming archive. And I'm going to walk you guys through the archive. That's where I need the most discussion. The second is running war games and simulations. So we are running war games, but these war games are generally outside funded. So these are games that are series that look at iteration, that can be run for multi-year time periods with a wide variety of different types of players. So I'll talk a little bit more about what we have on the books, but we're asking some of the big questions about emerging technology. And then finally, fostering the wargaming community. And the wargaming community is already has all sorts of opportunities to collaborate and work together. What we want to do is try and focus on data and to incentivize work on the methodology of wargaming, to build a community and to provide resources. So much of the wargaming community is proprietary. Our focus is on being open source and having as much materials that people can use to use war games in the classroom or in the policy world. Next slide. Okay, so welcome to our collection. This is really exciting. So this collection is actually live as of yesterday, which is a really exciting moment. So you can find it on our website. This is the Wargaming and Crisis Simulation Initiative collection, which lives in the Hoover Library and Archives website. So there's actually a link on our main page that you can go to click right here. Next slide. Okay. So what I'm showing you right now is a beta. We are building this structure right now, and we have spent a lot of time and effort trying to build the structure. The focus in building this archive is not to just throw as many things as we can into the archive, though that's wonderful. It's to organize that data in a way that is really friendly to the researcher. So that includes investing in technology that allows you to do searches substantively through the materials, but also, and this is kind of moving into the next phase, also we'll be tagging and organizing the data so that if you want to run a game that takes an hour and a half with 6 players on US-China, you can will be able to go through our search list just like as if you were shopping and pick out a game, or if you're researching on games run by StratCom, that you'll actually be able to select that and select out all the games. So this will allow, the focus here is on making sure that the researcher has everything at their tools to be able to do cross-data, cross-game analysis. So right now, we have a relatively small collection that's in there, and it's a little bit the Jackie Schneider collection, but that's okay. So we have, for example, this is a game series that I'm running now. Can we click on this? Or the next slide. Thank you. So once you go in here, this is all the game materials. So I'm running this game, but you can run it too. So all the game materials are here, all the information about data collection. So you can go here, here's the order of battles, the player guides, the response plans, the scenario briefs. So we've built file structures so that every game that is uploaded, if they have these materials, they go into these files. So if you just really need some surveys, or I need some response sheets, you can actually search just for response sheets and see what you want. So as a game designer, it allows you to have a lot of the tools right at your fingertips. Next slide. So you can see if you click on the response plan, you'll actually be able to see it within the viewer. So you can quickly know, do I want this? Do I not want this? So it makes it easier as a researcher. So PDFs, docx's, JPEGs, TIFFs, they'll all be previewed directly in the viewer. No download necessary. Next slide. Spreadsheets, those can be previewed in the document. You have to download them to run your any sort of data analysis on it. But in this way, so like one of the game series that I've already completed that has the data is uploaded. So you can test my work. You can replicate it. You can use the data to ask different questions. Next slide. So we have these different levels. You can download the entire game, or you can download an individual folder or the file itself. So you can pick and choose what you want. Next slide. And then this is where we're kind of building out is the record level metadata. So you have kind of a bit of an abstract that talks about the substance of the game, as well as any information about design. And I think that's going to be something that's really different than a normal library. Because we're making sure that you as the researcher have information, not only like, oh, it's a cyber-nuclear game, but hey, this has this type of adjudication, things that might actually be hard for you to sift through as a researcher otherwise. And then this is exciting for me as a researcher, you get a citation. So when we acquire materials, we also give credit to the author. And therefore, let's say you've been working on a game, you've never gotten credit for it, but people use it all the time. Now you can actually be cited because this will give the contributors a citation to their work. Next slide. In terms of searchability, the folders themselves can be searchable. So like the player guides, for example, will all come up. Next slide. But also words. So the text is searchable as well. Next slide. So this is an example. This is within the file previewer fisheries. So it's good. It's delving into the actual data. So we're making sure that this data is as accessible as possible so that you as the researcher, for any of you who have spent time in archives, it can be a process where you are having to spend a lot of time as the researcher going through the materials. We're doing basically all of that for you here. We've focused on you getting as much of those resources as possible. Next slide. Okay, so here's where we are. What I just showed you is a beta version of the database. So we have a few game series that I've worked on, as well as open source games that we've downloaded from public records, just a few of them. And why there's only a few is because we've been working really hard to make sure we have the logics behind the archive structure done appropriately. It's also what I'd love to talk to you guys about in question and answer. We also want to do this right. So we've worked with our team at Library and Archives to make sure that we have a deed of gift, that we've thought about intellectual property rights, that we have a process so that people were retaining the intellectual property rights that you want to have when you give up your data. Right now, this is just open source acquisition. So we've been focusing on what I would call easy acquisition. So my stuff that's already publicly accessible. But the next steps will be things that I actually need to go out and talk to probably people in this room about acquiring their data. And right now, we have a bit of a manual process as we've been building the process, how we build the structure. But the hope is that moves to more automated in the future. Next slide. Okay, so that is the centerpiece of what Hoover is doing. We're also running war games. So we finished the International Crisis War Game series, which Ben Schechter and the Naval War College were a part of that process. All those, that one's officially done. We have 2 ongoing game series, a Maritime Crisis War Game series, and one on AI, which is a US-China one with CSAC, and then 2 future game series on the horizon, one on space, and that's with Georgia Tech and the USAFA, and then one on US-China and academia. So our focus is really to only run 2 or 3 game series in a year. So the focus is on quality, not necessarily doing lots and lots of games. The thing in the future is we'd like to be able to have fellowships where people can come in and run games with us. And then the idea behind that fellowship would that be that any game that they develop with us also is acquired by the archive. Next slide. All right, and then finally, wargaming community, and that's a little bit of kind of what's happening in this room. We are working on kind of methodology questions, questions about what makes a war game different than other types of information for policy planning, what makes a good war game. But also the goal of this is that the materials that we are developing can be used to teach, and we're already have given a lot of these resources to universities to be able to implement. And then a series of outreach kind of through Hoover, including we had, which John Emery was on before, a wargaming webinar series that was also featured on C-SPAN. And then we actually work in boot camps that we host at Hoover. We have one where we help discuss with congressional staffers how we think about war games and how they influence policy and what makes a good war game and a bad war game. Next slide. All right, so where are we going? So the focus in the next 6 months to a year is on that archive. It's on moving from what is kind of an open source acquisition model to an active acquisition, going to think tanks, academics, already declassified US games to be able to bring those in. We're also working on the increased automation and search funds. And then I'd like in the future to actually be able to provide an incentive fund for some of that material. In terms of wargame facilitation, we're looking to do about 2 to 3 games a year. But we'd like to expand it outside of Hoover and bring in scholars from other places. And then the hope in the next year is actually this wargaming methodology book, and potentially to bring in fellowships for people to run war games at Hoover using our resources. All right. I've now sprayed a lot of information at you. But I'd love to kind of open up the discussion. Feedback, this is one of these situations where it can be a comment. It doesn't have to be a question. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts, what you would need, what you would want using it, any kind of thoughts about how we might be able to work with you all in the future.
Hi, Jackie. I'm Josh Rovner from American University, and this is terrific. And I come at this as not a wargaming specialist by any stretch of the imagination. Participated in a lot of games, but I've never designed one. I want to think about how I can make use of it as a scholar, as somebody who teaches strategic studies and works in a number of related areas. So I guess a couple of comments on how to move this initiative forward, because I think it's a great idea. I love archives. This is a terrific opportunity. But the first thing that comes to mind is, how are you going to get beyond the gaming community? Because ultimately, you're trying to appeal to a lot of different other audiences. So you talked about Congress, you talked about the services, you talked about the broader academic community. And one thing that comes to mind initially is providing examples of the kind of research that would benefit from access to this archive, right? So if you are a historian, here is what you could do after you play around at the Hoover archive for a while. Like, here's the great thing that you could do that's different from going to, say, a presidential library and, thumbing through all those old records. Here's how your research could benefit. For the IR theory community, for the strategic studies community, for the intelligence studies community, here are concrete examples of the kind of great work you could do if you come here and you take advantage of this opportunity. Because I think that for a lot of folks like me who are on the outside of the gaming community, it feels a little bit exotic, right? This is the thing that sort of military people do, and they sit around and they play these games, but we're old-fashioned scholars. We go to the presidential libraries and we thumb through those old records. That's how we do our jobs. So a part of the issue is convincing us old, stuck in the mud old-timers how to take advantage of this, a very different kind of archive, right? And just some colorful illustrations I think would help a lot. One other thing that I think might help, just one other suggestion, is categorizing past games that have present value. So you mentioned in the list of sort of upcoming games that you're going to run, games on artificial intelligence, which is obviously in the news a lot. So when I hear something like that, a game about AI, I think, all right, what is this an example? This is an example of people trying to figure out the implications of some emerging technology. All right. So as a scholar, I say, what are past examples in which people have struggled to figure out the implications of a new technology kind of on the threshold of its arrival? Right? How did people game out nuclear issues when nukes were new? How did people game out aircraft carriers when aircraft carriers were new? When they hadn't seen the real world thing in play and they're trying to sort it out, right? So if you could, either on the online version or in person, here's a category, not just a list of the game, but here's the kind of question that you're trying to answer. That would be very cool, and that would make it real for the sort of non-gaming community. And then I just have a couple of little questions, if you'll indulge me. So one is, in any archive, so much depends on the archivist. Right? Everything depends on, you rely on these people. Right? They're your heroes. Are you the archivist?
Oh God, no.
Okay. Is there going to be one?
Archivist is here. So Shab is over here in the corner. Shab is the lead archivist on this project. And actually, if you go to her, go to the bio and the agenda page, there is a bio for Shab. We were really lucky enough to steal her from the Navy. And before the Navy, she was at the Library of Congress. Yeah, so we really lucked out. And Shab has been instrumental, not just instrumental, she has made this happen. And we have an extraordinary library and archives team. Eric Waken in the back, who runs the entire program and has been a huge support. Talia, who's not here, but who has been actually leading in the technological acquisition and development that brings this archive to the next level, or this collection to the next level. But yes, Shab is your archivist.
You said that part of what's available is participant guides, right, for past games. Is there a way of searching participant identities?
Oh, that's a really good question. And that's actually a funky one. Because there's an ethical obligation. So, for example, if you pull up my game series, one of the things I've included is the IRB application for both game series. Well, the requirement of the IRB at Stanford was that this was completely anonymized. So no, you will not get a participant list from my game series. But some of the historical games, there probably are. So for us, as we're acquiring these games, if these are scholarly games that come under the purview of an IRB, we ethically will make sure that the participants' information is protected at whatever level the IRB required it to be protected at. But that for historical games, potentially there may be participant lists. That's one of the categories that we'll ask people for, but understanding that that can't always be given. But historically, it would be much better to have that participant list. And thank you for the comments, Josh. Those are extremely helpful. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Mir Chamatano, I'm a historian at the Department of State. The good news is that thinking about what you just described, my brain is firing in overdrive right now, because I can imagine absolutely brilliant integration of historical wargaming from our side and the absolute tremendous number of war games that we now have access to from the former Warsaw Pact countries, and for that matter, Ukraine and so on. So I can see down the line, clearly not your first step here, but down the line, an integration between what we were thinking, what they were thinking, and sort of like bringing it all together. But I think the question that I have has to do a little bit with either maybe it's the methodology of how you put those things together, or I guess the cautioning that you include at the top of the war games or whatever. And that is to say, as a historian, one of my immediate sort of pullbacks is people always ask, well, give me an analogy that's going to like short circuit my way to the best decision that I can make. And the general answer is, well, it's complicated. And here it's also complicated. And just because you've done a war game through a particular on a particular scenario doesn't mean that you take that war game and then apply it willy-nilly as hoping that the decision works out. So how do you prevent this sort of short circuit of actually analyzing the present as opposed to just sort of relying on the past? Or is this just, listen, this is an educational tool, this is a training tool, and it teaches you to think, but then how do you prevent people from just forgetting that part of it and relying mostly on the experience?
Yeah, so I think that's an extremely important question. And it's actually part of why we wanted to build this archive, or this collection in the archive, because a lot of the lessons taken from war games are taken from single war games. And they might be the right lesson, but it's very difficult to know if you don't look at things over a long period of time. So the idea behind this is that we have enough resources here that somebody could do a larger study and be able to look beyond one single war game. And they're a really good example of this work already being done. John Emery, who I've now mentioned a few times, who's in the room, has done this work with the RAND archive, but also Reed Pauly at Brown University, who has looked at a series of war games conducted by Lincoln Bloomfield in the MIT archive. And the reason why these pieces are so good is because they looked at many games and many iterations. But for both of them, the RAND archive is not publicly accessible. And the Bloomfield archive, I believe, is just physically located at MIT. So also not an open resource unless you go. So our goal is to be able to bring all these things together to be able to answer more of those questions. And actually, I have a co-authored paper with Reed Pauly and Eric Lane Greenberg that talks specifically about how to think about war games as data, especially in the archive process. And wouldn't you know, we printed them out and they're sitting up in the front. So there's a European Journal of International Relations. And we've got a whole section on the promise and pitfall of wargaming data for understanding historical concepts. But I completely agree with you that we should not take one as an analogy for the future. And I would love to talk to you more about the way we can work with the Department of State.
Thanks, Jackie. This was a great presentation. So Jenny McCardle, I'm Senior Director at CAE, so I'm an industry person in the room. And so my question comes back, I guess, to industry. So I think, everyone in this room knows there's a fundamental difference between war games and computer-based simulations. I think industry really struggles with this. And as a result, you have a lot of capabilities that are brought to market or they're procured where an exercise is mistaken for a war game or a computer-based simulation is mistaken as a war game, and you end up with war gamers that are fundamentally dissatisfied. And quite frankly, it's a waste of our taxpayer dollars. And so I guess my question for you is, have you thought about, when you think about doing these like boot camps for Congress or for senior leaders, have you thought about doing them for industry? Because I can tell you, industry, a lot of people need your help.
Wow, we have not thought about doing industry. So that's a really great suggestion. And I think in general, we've talked about this before. Somebody needs to study how these different mediums, whether they're virtual or a board game or a tabletop, influence the outcomes of the game and how important they are or are not towards creating good war games. Because I think you're right. I think there is a general conflation of computer gaming and war games. And for me, just so you guys know where I'm coming from, I view games as essentially about human behaviors. There are different mediums through which these human behaviors play, but they are ultimately only interesting because of the human element to them. If there are not humans in it, then it's a simulation. And that's or a model. But I want to understand the weirdness of how people interact when put in these scenarios. Thank you. We'll have to come back to you about the industry idea.
Hi, Steve Orman Rand. Directly on that point about the human element in war games, and your comments about sort of the potential for large N analysis and also repetition of the games, right? Those two things are directly at odds, right?
I
Because
think we're going to reference a bit of a back and forth. Was it Nature or was it Science, where you had Andrew Reddy and the Berkeley team saying we need large N games, and then there was a RAND team that said yes, but it needs to be a focus on the type of players.
I agree with you. Those are views of my colleagues, not particularly myself. But I do, I have a different critique of that.
Okay.
That presupposes, I guess my core critique would be that if you're thinking about large N games that are run over time, right, you have to close the model, you have to close the way you adjudicate the game, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're getting learning effects from the facilitation team, right, which bias the results.
Right.
Okay, which is sort of different than the critique that was played out in the science Nature.
Yeah.
So that presupposes that you've modeled the phenomena correctly in the first place, and a lot of where war games have value is in places where we're not sure what even the concept might be, right? We listen into the keynote, well, economic competition. Well, what does it really mean for two economies to compete? Sanctions is one small aspect of that. So I'm curious how you sort of square that circle, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think this is a slightly different question than where I thought you were going. So I'll talk about the game series that Ben and I worked on. We ran it over 3 years, 580 players, all over the world. In order to do that level of iteration, we had to be extremely controlled, which means that we sacrificed adjudication. We went to 2 separate moves. And so we knew that if we included adjudication and multi-moves or multi-side, that being able to do that kind of controlled work was going to be extremely, extremely difficult. Now, that was a choice we made because at the time, there were not a lot of game series that I would run that many times in a controlled way. I think in the future, we might make different traces because we did lose out on some elements of gaming by not having the multi-move and not having adjudication. But I think in general, this question of kind of how adjudication and control and iteration interact with each other and where researchers need to make trade-offs based on the research question, I think that's an under-discussed phenomenon in war games. And that's exactly the type of question that we want to bring forth through this initiative. And by providing people with more data and also replication data. Like you see all my work. You can replicate it, which is like a core element of social science. That's part of what we're trying to do. And it's not saying that any one of these has made all the right traces, but that scholars, practitioners can actually evaluate those traces in an honest way. I think we have one in the back.
Hey, I'm Sarah Bassett. I'm with the House Financial Services Committee. So I'm not that familiar with wargaming data and outcomes. So I was wondering if it's possible to look through what you have on the website. And for example, like if I wanted to do a meta-analysis or qualitative synthesis of, I know that this is something that you're doing in the future, but if I wanted to look at US-China economic outcomes in war games, is data tagged in such a way on the website that it could do something similar with something that you have on there?
So it will be. So US-China economic, yes, you'll be able to get all games that have an economic component and look at US and China. It will then be incumbent on you, because all that data is going to come out differently. Like I'm not putting any rules on the game designers or the people who I'm acquiring the war games for to fit in a model of how they represent their data. So then the hard part becomes now you have to sift through a lot of different types of data to look at those outcomes. But you should be able to. And that's the goal, is that you'll be able to get to that level. And for you as a researcher, you can just type in 3 or 4 words or pull them up on the side and be able to get enough information for you to look across the games. And that'll give you a better understanding of like patterns of how these outcomes have occurred in the game series.
Hello, I'm Matthew Smith from I'm a professor at the Air Force Academy. Thank you for inviting me here. So I had a question kind of on the technical aspect, following up on like the meta-analysis. You're bringing together diverse groups of people. You have social science methodologists, you have wargamers, you're talking about applying artificial intelligence to get causal inference maybe. And maybe for you, Shab, here is like, what's the lexicon for these? What does this look like, right? So, and I think that's important to develop this early on, because you're going to want to have to structure this data in a way where you can actually apply these more novel methods. And then not just structure, we have volunteers who people are volunteering their information. So then you have to provide the incentives on top for them to follow through with the rules of that. Getting a citation is a good first step on that, right? And kind of tying that back and forth with adopting that. So I think if just a piece of it, like an advice would be like early on.
Yeah.
Early on with that lexicon across these communities.
So this is actually like why you have very few things in the database right now and a lot more focus on structure, because Shab and I have gone back and forth on the lexicon of the structure. But we're not done. We have not completely refined it. It's also part of why we wanted to present this to you guys here, and I can definitely send you this briefing, and the archive is live. You can, right now, it's still the beta, so it doesn't have all the tagging, but you can right now tell me things that you disagree with. Or I will say, for example, one of the categories that we were organizing the data by is the type of adjudication. But yeah, it's not super fun figuring out the difference between like stochastic, deterministic. Like, I'm like, wait a second, maybe I don't want this determination because there's too much kind of question about what this type of adjudication is. And there's some things that are really easy, like how many players, that's relatively easy. But some of these terms that are debated within the wargaming community can be really tough. And so part of what if this is successful, it will also drive how people think about categories within wargaming. So I want to be able to do it right. So please do play with the archive. I can also send you offline the structure that we're moving to for the next version, so that you can see how we've chosen to, what categories we've chosen and how we think about defining those. And then the final limitation, right now, I'm not requiring anybody to put it in these bins. It comes to us and we put it in those bins. Well, that is extremely labor intensive, and right now involves a significant amount of expertise. Also a limb fact for why there's not more in here. So this summer we're experimenting with an intern, this in a completely appropriate way, to help us with the kind of working through the manual processes so that we can build the automated structure. But that's actually where we see AI being extremely helpful. Like right now, when you go to the abstract or the scope, we wrote it, right? There's no reason I need to write it. ChatGPT could write it, right? I just need to, so that's, I don't really see AI in this being extremely useful for causal inferences, but for us, it would be really nice to have more machine learning or some level of AI to be able to categorize the data appropriately. That's our near-term goal.
John Compton, Office of Secretary of Defense. I'm so glad you said it's okay to disagree.
Yes.
So this interaction is where, as a practitioner who can't really participate because everything I do is classified, I both admire what you're trying to do, but also have a tremendous amount of exasperation for what you're trying to do.
Okay.
And it stems from my personal belief that you're taking a method and trying to turn that into a warehouse of studies that people can access and do inferential things with. And I fundamentally have a problem with that, in the sense that it's hard to articulate, because one of the problems that we have with wargaming is we don't have a common epistemology, because we don't use wargaming for the same things. We use very different things. I do analytical wargaming, right? And as someone that does analytical wargaming, I can tell you that right now I'm running a wargame that is now in month 4 of constant, strictly, rigidly adjudicated on a board. One of the things I've discovered, compared with deep, hard, analytical, operational war games, is that when you get at the end of that, and then you get in front of people who do the pole mill thinking, is that there's often a tremendous disconnect between what the actual operational capabilities are and what strategic desires are, because the two don't understand each other. But the thing is, the games that you're going to get in your archive are largely going to be higher level games, okay, that suffer from that lack of connective tissue. And so when you're going to use this for causal inference, the thing about war games like that aren't part of a larger study, that aren't integrated with other methods, that aren't cross method levels of analysis, you have essentially a pooling of common experience and knowledge and opinion that, as the framework for reality moves forward, becomes more and more disconnected with what the current reality actually is. And what wargaming does is it generates a framework for constructing your current reality. So the further I dig into the history, right, the farther I am away from what's currently happening now, and the inferences become less and less important. Wargaming is a thing I have to conduct as a method for study questions I have now. When we have a wargaming archive in the Pentagon, it's a wargaming repository. It's very seldom consulted because the problem sets change very rapidly in very small amounts of time.
And I do think that...
So I'm just, I think you have a scoping problem is what I'm getting at.
I actually do think we are hitting different audiences. You'll probably never see me play a campaign game at an unclassified thing at Hoover. And other people do it very nicely, but I've worked those games, and there's no way in God's green earth that I can do that on the unclassified way with the same level of rigor about campaign outcomes. But you're right. I do think unclassified games can actually be extremely useful for the Paul Mill and the strategic. So is the database going to skew towards historical campaigns and current Paul Mill questions? Yes. The chances that I still have a clearance. I'm not going to be grabbing classified material. I'm publishing classified material in this database. So the chances that we're going to be having campaign games, no. But exactly to Josh's point at the beginning, the point is that there are kind of general behaviors and understandings that come from looking at a wide variety of cases historically, or one case in a very deep way that can help us understand maybe not who wins a U.S.-China war, but are there things that we can learn from history that have applications for today. So I completely agree with you, actually. And I would not hope that somebody would look at this initiative and think that we're going to be able to tell you who's going to win a U.S.-China war. Absolutely not. But my hope is that we fill this up with enough information that we can better understand the decision-making that leads to war, that we can better understand patterns of behaviors, that we see tendencies across multiple games. That's the hope. There's no way in the world I am replicating a classified wargame repository from today.
Hi, Paul Bernstein from National Defense University. Jackie, thank you so much. I want to come back to the first question, I think from our State Department colleague, who sort of raised, which was really, I think, an effort to raise a cautionary flag about the risks of bad learning, because we've all experienced bad learning, sometimes very bad learning in the context of some of these games. So I guess I'm going to ask you a question in a more pointed way. I mean, are you doing any filtering or screening in terms of the games you're putting in the archive? Are you doing any due diligence on these games? Is there a risk of an assumption being created that anything that shows up in your archive is, because it's there, considered to be a successful game or a high-quality analytic product? Is there a place in your approach for expert commentary Or is that sort of against the spirit of what you're trying to do here?
So I'm not going to qualify whether it is a good game or a bad game. I have personal beliefs about what I think are good games and bad games. But bad games sometimes tell us something about the designer or the historical context in which it was designed that is useful beyond that. No, like any archive, we're not making a judgment about whether the information we're presented is the most rigorous, but instead that we can provide a service to researchers in the future to be able to make those choices themselves. I bet if you surveyed a room of wargamers, they would not come up with the same definition of what a good game is. So I'm definitely not trying to place that on the archive. But man, if you had access to a lot of different games, maybe you could answer that question in a rigorous way. I mean, I want to open the kimono, so to speak, and allow people to really look into games so that they can make that determination. I am as concerned about bad learning as you are, and I see that there is a pitfall in the current use of games in policy, in that they can be extremely experiential, which makes them maybe believed better than other evidence. And that's a strong responsibility then if you're running games. So I agree with you. And we are going to let in the good and the bad. We do have an ethical checklist to make sure that, like, if it doesn't hit the ethics, there are certain requirements, then that would not be appropriate. So there is some level of filtering, but not about whether it's a good game, bad game. Now, I want to give you guys a break before our next panel. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But we have 10 minutes, so we can definitely talk while we're waiting for our next panelist, which these are extraordinary voices in this world. So thank you, guys.